Hi, my name is Lucas, and I will present our paper, What Makes Effective Leadership in Agile Software Development. This paper was written by me. I'm at Chalmers and University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and by Paul Ralph, which is at Dalhousie University in Canada. So what makes effective leadership in Agile software development teams? Well, we found out that Agile teams share leadership work rather than having an individual leader. They build a sense of belonging and common purpose across and within organizational functions. And by functions, we mean organizational aspects of functions here. So finance, HR, whatever it might be, different disciplines within an organization, if you will. They adapt their processes to different cultures which exist simultaneously within a single organization. Okay, so a brief method description. All of this is, of course, detailed in the paper. So we use semi-structured interviews with 13 professionals who identify as Agile leaders in different roles from 10 different companies. And we investigate, of course, their perception of Agile leadership in software engineering. So leadership in Agile, is that a missing piece? There are studies on leadership. And I think many of us recognize the importance of some kind of a leadership, but we will define that more thoroughly in a minute. So there are studies on leadership as an individual role. Who are leaders in software engineering companies? The leadership aspects of Agile roles, Scrum Masters, POs, what type of leadership behavior do they express? Leadership styles, there are different styles of leading. Leadership as a component of self-organization has also been in some focus. Of course, self-organization of Agile teams is at the core of how we want this team to function. And also cultural aspects of SE leadership has also been investigated. However, leadership in the 21st century has taken somewhat new directions in psychology specifically. So leadership is seen as a dynamic and integrated into the social process of group formation. So it's about the social dynamics, how leadership emerges and how that function is distributed. So research on leadership in social psychology. There's been a lot of different changes in leadership research. The first one was about personality traits and individual differences. And this includes the great man theory. When this started many years ago, a lot of researchers had and maybe, of course, that reflects society as well, that these were great men that had innate or acquired individual characteristics that made them just excellent leaders. And then the distinction between leader and manager was not that great. Then they started looking at situational perspective for the reason that they could not explain what was going on by just looking at individuals. So then leadership is the product of a context instead. These theories have been critiqued in psychology because it's only a product of the context, and that's not true either. Another paradigm is to look at what leaders actually do, the behavior. So the actual behaviors of leaders. It typically divides leaders into task focused or relationship focused. That's also quite simplistic. Continuous theories of leadership, then it's one specific leadership behavior in one specific context at one time. And that's also a bit too simplistic to understand what is really going on. After that, they started focusing quite a lot on transactional leadership. So that's the transactional resources between the leader and the follower. So there's no group process involved here. And transformational leadership, how leaders can transform goals into action using charisma. So charismatic leaders lead well and they get followers to buy their visions and goals and work for them. This is also quite leader-focused theories. Leader perceptions is a branch of cognitive psychology. For example, leader categorization theory that posits that our perception of leadership influences how selection and endorsement of leaders, our selection and endorsement of leaders. So our perception of what a leader is influences who we endorse as leaders, which makes a lot of sense, but it's also on the individual level. That's an important component. So if you look at more contemporary research on leadership, and we conducted this study first and we got our findings, and then we started looking into the specifically social psychology research to see what is the latest there. Could we make sense of what these practitioners were saying in the light of that, so we don't just create our own theory of agile leadership. So in contemporary research on leadership, they say that leaders of complex projects, which is often the case in software development, I would say, they create, maintain, and refine collective systems of meaning and expectation, which in turn guide the behavior of individuals. So less control and direction, and more of the leader's developmental and instructional capabilities applied over time. So it's about the group dynamics, and it's about what the leader does in relation to what the group is doing. And it's a dual relationship, of course. And members of effective teams, the most effective ones, they share leadership dynamic. And this is, of course, in line with what we can find in research on agile leadership in software development as well. So the distribution of leadership among team members is constantly in flux. So to define leadership as a role or as a person makes little sense in the agile context, we would argue. Granak even suggests that leadership is a function of group action. So it's a function, not a role, and that function in high-performing or effective teams, that function is dynamically shared, depending on who has the energy this week, who is the more competent on what we're working on right now. And we all do leadership in a very effective team. We all take on the leadership role once in a while. And then we have social identity theory of leadership. That models leadership as a relationship between group members, can influence each other to adopt and perceive as their own new values, attitudes, and goals. So it's about the function of leadership and the dynamic of sharing that function that is in focus, instead of individual traits or roles or personalities, for example. Another aspect that is sort of surrounding this, it's the ecosystem, if you will. Organizational culture has been shown to be important in many different research fields. So leadership and social identity are inseparable from culture. And this is because culture is a particularistic system of symbols shaped by ambient society and organization's history. Leadership and continues is differentially shared, used, and modified by actors in the course of acting and making sense out of our organizational events. So this is the ecosystem, if you will, and the newest understanding of leadership in agile teams must be situated in organizations' ongoing cultural conflict, because organizations have many different cultures at the same time, especially big companies. And also when they are in an organizational change, you will have an older, and in the software development case, a milestone-driven culture often that they change from, and then they have two different organizational cultures alive at the same time. And it's the balancing of these different cultures that is necessary, or was necessary in our findings. So if you connect our findings, which we did at the very end, okay, so the shared leadership work, rather than having individual leader, that's in line with contemporary research on dynamic team leadership. To build a sense of belonging and common purpose was also something that the participants, all of them, spoke about across and within organizational functions. And this is what we find in research on social identity theory, that it's important to the different groups at work and the team, and also whoever the team members collaborate with, they need to create a sense of belonging. Their groups at work need to be part of their social identity and the groups that they categorize themselves into. So a big part of who we think we are is our membership of different social groups. What groups we categorize ourselves into. Are we a tester, a developer? Are we a business person? Are we a manager? This is important. And they also adapt their processes to the different cultures which exist simultaneously within a single organization. So the influence of culture is definitely there, and that is the surrounding and the ecosystem. And organizations usually, if they're not recently started, have a history of how they used to do things. And that is something that agile leaders need to be balancing. Not only in our sample, we also have more recently started companies that started as agile in their view, but they still need to balance culture when they have customers that are not of the same culture as they have. So then they need to adapt their processes to a different culture with the customer. Okay, so to summarize this, the key takeaway. So we motivated this study by 3 realizations. Leadership is crucial for projects and organization. We think it's unfortunate if we say that agile teams don't have leadership, because if we define leadership as a function of action, we understand that someone needs to drive work, and we think it's helpful. It seems helpful that the organizations they seem aware of this, and that the function needs to be dynamically shared, even if that's not the vocabulary they use. A little research has investigated how leadership works in self-managed agile teams. And 3, software engineering research has not embraced recent advances in psychological research on leadership. We therefore conducted a qualitative survey of 13 software professionals. And our main contribution is this model. This is the summary of the findings that I've shown you. So briefly, leadership is a kind of work rather than a job role. So it's distinctly different from a manager, for example. A manager is a role and a responsibility to implement certain organizational strategies. But leadership is different. And in self-organized or self-managed teams, they dynamically share leadership work among the team members. And that is important to understand to describe what is happening in agile teams. And employees are more willing to accept leadership work and responsibility when they identify as belonging to their teams. That is something that was very apparent in the results. Effective leadership often involves balancing conflicting cultures. For example, agile versus milestone driven. And that was the case in all larger companies that are in our sample. So since this is a purely qualitative study, we aim to explain rather than predict. And for future work, we could quantitatively assess the antecedents and consequences of effective leadership using validated scales, for example, validated scales of social identity. And there are other things that would be very interesting to research in the future. One example is leader prototypicality. That's the idea that a more typical team member become better at leadership work in that team. And also something that has been quite researched for some time, and when scaling agile, this is under research an important aspect, and that's intergroup bias. So favoritism towards one's teammates, in-group, out-group. So that the groups that teams that I'm a part of, that's what I prioritize. And we have bias against other groups then. And we think also that software engineering researchers need to get better in integrating theories and findings from reference disciplines and collaborate that directly with scientists from other disciplines. We don't say that the psychology research theories are directly applicable, and we don't think they should be. They should be tested in this context. And in our case, we find many similarities between contemporary research and the description of these agile leaders of what is going on. So while cross-disciplinary research is intrinsically challenging, software engineering is intrinsically cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary. So only by appreciating research from other disciplines, we can effectively understand, explain, predict, and prescribe software engineering phenomena. Thank you.